Welcome. My name is Millicent Hennessy, and I am the student trustee for Wake Forest University. Tonight, we are in for a treat as President Nathan Hatch engages nonprofit leader Jonathan Reckford in a meaningful conversation around leadership and his life. But before we begin, I would like to call your attention to your program. Following the conversation, there will be an opportunity to pose questions to Mr. Reckford. Mics will be in the aisles, and we will source questions from Twitter. For those of you watching the live stream, this is a great way to join tonight's discussion. We ask that you please tweet in your questions using the hashtag WFULeads. During the Q&A, I will serve as moderator, and we will alternate between questions from the audience and the Twitter. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming University President Dr. Hatch.
Thank you. Thank you, Millicent. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for what I anticipate will be a most engaging conversation. When we launched the Leadership Project some 2 years ago, we did so with the intention of inviting members of the Wake Forest community and beyond to learn from notable leaders. These individuals represent a variety of professional paths, backgrounds, and worldviews. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Jonathan Reckford, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity International. After earning his bachelor's degree from UNC Chapel Hill, where he was a Moorhead Scholar, and a brief stint at Goldman Sachs, Mr. Reckford was named a Henry Luce Scholarship recipient. That experience offered him the opportunity to work with the Seoul Olympic Organizing Committee, to live in Korea for a year, where he actually helped coach the Korean rowing team in preparation for the 1988 Olympics. He then earned his MBA at Stanford and held executive and managerial positions with Marriott, the Walt Disney Company, and Best Buy. His success in business is paralleled by a staying commitment to local faith communities. Recognizing that his business acumen was valued in the not-for-profit world, Mr. Reckford began coaching local pastors in business management, and then became executive pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church, a 4,300-member church in Edina, Minnesota. In 2005, a decade ago, Mr. Reckford assumed the mantle of CEO of Habitat for Humanity International, including its 1,450 U.S. affiliates and work in more than 70 countries. Last year alone, entities helped more than 300,000 families. Additionally, Mr. Reckford serves on the boards of Interaction, the Stanford Graduate School of Business, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and the Duke Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship. Reflections from his years of service are captured in his book, Creating a Habitat for Humanity, No Hands But Yours. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Jonathan Reckford. Tonight, I would like to begin at the beginning and ask Jonathan about his childhood, his upbringing, and what were the central factors in shaping your character and your interests.
Thank you. And first, let me just say how pleased I am to be back at Wake and how delighted to be here with all of you. I think I was incredibly blessed. I grew up very close to here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and had my father was a classics professor at UNC for decades, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom who was a passionate fighter for civil rights, and actually had the distinction of being the first person tied to the university faculty or staff to be arrested for picketing segregated restaurants. And so I actually went to jail, but as a bystander, but not. But I think for me, My dad had deep intellectual curiosity and a deep faith as well. So we grew up in a devout but non-culturally Catholic family, and faith was always part of life. And then, Chapel Hill was just a great environment, I think, to grow and explore. And I think a few inflection points. When I was 7, we moved to England for a year, and my father was on sabbatical. And England is about as close as you can get to a foreign experience, but it's still a very different experience. And I think started that bigger picture of the world, and then that continued with later opportunities. But I think certainly my parents, grandmother and godmother, had huge shaping influences early in life.
Yeah, could you say more about your grandmother and any other mentors that helped shape you?
I think about role models, and I was blessed to have a couple of extraordinary women in my life who in different ways really gave me a picture of how I want to serve. My grandmother was an iconoclastic, most of you are far too young to remember, but was one of the early women in Congress, and she was a congresswoman from New Jersey. Her name was Millicent Fenwick, and she had an unusual background, but she, earlier in life, had been a fashion model, and then in the wartime, World War II, was the editor of Vogue magazine. And she wrote the Vogue Book of Etiquette in 1947, sold 1 million copies. So, but then went into public service and was a tremendous fighter for human rights. And she helped desegregate Trenton and Newark, and then Walter Cronkite, who you would compare him to today, but at that time, the #1 broadcaster described her as the conscience of Congress. And so going to her house every summer and Christmas was actually a pretty intimidating thing. To graduate to the grown-up table at her house, you had to wear coat and tie and be able to sit up straight, hold your fork properly, and discuss food problems in sub-Saharan Africa, which for a 10-year-old was a lot. And but she would drill in on her grandchildren almost every time I saw her. And the first question she'd ask is, what are you going to do to be useful? And her view in life is we're supposed to be useful, and then challenge us on what that might look like. And I found her just fascinating. And so growing up, I wanted to go into politics. And the other sort of towering figure all through my life has been my godmother, who was another pioneer, and her name is Jill Kerr Conway, and she was the first woman to be president of Smith College, and she had all that same fire for justice, but also had a really remarkable ability to be totally in the present. And so when I was with her, I felt like I was the only person that existed yet. And I was slowly, as I grew up, realized that she had this incredibly big life and all these responsibilities and all these things going on, but had a quite extraordinary ability to be totally in the moment with whoever she was with and is with. And she's become that sort of go-to mentor whenever I had big decisions to make in life. I'd always make a pilgrimage back to her to talk those through.
Very good. Jonathan, your career really has had 2 different phases, both in the for-profit world and then for more than a decade now in the not-for-profit organization. Could you have seen that from the beginning? Was that, in a sense, your intent?
So short answer, absolutely not. I think I kind of laugh. I think the danger of the resume is it cleans everything up. And we show everybody, it's like Facebook, you show everybody your ESPN highlight reel, not the messy realities of how you get there. But I had for the students in the room, I think, when I was young, I was just a bundle of raw ambition and fairly unguided. And it was... And I think I had a long-term idea that I wanted to do something mission-oriented and something to be useful in the world, but had really very little picture of how to do that or how to go about it. And I look back, and I really think God has a sense of humor, because when I look back, I can see how all those pieces have actually fit together. But all the way along, I would say it was more like riding a whitewater course in a canoe, and you're just trying to figure out how to navigate along the way and make the best decision at each curve or turn, as opposed to a neat, clean path. But I did go into the private sector after business school, not from college, but after business school, with the idea long-term of learning skills in the private sector and then eventually bringing them out to the nonprofit world. Yeah. I just had no idea how that was going to play out.
Yeah. So what advice would you have for students who feel a variety of pressures about what they should do with their life? Particularly, they may have a keen interest, their parents may have different ideas. What advice would you have for students in that situation?
You know, first, I would say I want to be deeply respectful of the pressures and all the pieces. I was naive, and so I wouldn't claim that my experience was, is the right way. If I was a political science major who just took whatever looked interesting in college, and then I had to negotiate my way out of college because I had not taken all the requirements. I had 1 million credits, but it was. But I was going to go into law school and then go into politics, and then I had this shocking realization that I didn't want to be a lawyer. I just thought that's what you did to go into politics. So I had to find out something else to do. And I think if I had known I was going to go into a business job, I would have been a hair more practical than I had been. But what I would say is when I look at students, first of all, studying something that you feel like you ought to but don't really feel an affinity for or giftedness for is probably not a great approach, because it's unlikely you're going to really excel. I would say the second is whatever you study, really focus on critical thinking and communication skills, because from a long-term perspective, I've been a little dismayed by how often I'll meet some very bright young people with really poor communication skills. And the both written and oral communication is just core to any kind of leadership going forward. And then the last piece, so I'm still a fan of a strong liberal arts base, but it really should be driven by what really grabs you in the same way, and then recognize, my dad used to say, which was really helpful, he said, I would teach for free. They have to pay me to go to meetings. So, every job has stuff you love to do and stuff you don't love to do. The question is, can you get that ratio to kind of 80-20 on the love side as opposed to 20-80 and get that ratio right? The last piece I would share was a wonderful piece of wisdom I got my second year in graduate school, actually, from an amazing man named John Gardner, who retired from his illustrious public and nonprofit career to Stanford. And he said something that totally surprised me, but I really have held on to and shared, which he said, it doesn't actually matter what you do in your 20s. It may have nothing to do with your long-term vocation. The key is to view your whole next decade after college as continuing education and gain as much experience as you possibly can, and then see what that will turn into. And I thought that was great. It took some of the pressure off of finding the perfect first job, but it does say, particularly if you want to, focus in some area that is, I think you have to be. I'm sensitive and don't want to be dismissive of the risks of taking on a huge amount of college debt and then have no path or way to make up for it. And if I hope there's some in the room that want to go into mission or service careers. And practical reality is those don't pay as well. And my encouragement there is, I think now there are direct careers in the nonprofit world that didn't exist 25 years ago or 30 years ago. So you can go that path. Or if you feel led into the private sector, there's a desperate need for volunteers, for board members, for fundraisers, for everything else. And you can learn on that side, then make the change. But be intentional about it, because I can't tell you how many people I know who are doing things they don't actually love, but the golden handcuffs are kind of attached at this point, and they've created lifestyle choices they feel they can't get back out of. So one of the things I would say is, if you really want to go into a mission-driven life, even if you go into a lucrative near-term career, live a nonprofit lifestyle that will give you the flexibility later on to make the shift. And one of the choices my wife and I made is to live well beneath our income when I was in the private sector. And part of that was so that we would have, one, flexibility to make a change when the surprising change came, to take a pretty draconian cut in compensation. But the other side was to not get too attached to the material side in a way that that would stop us from doing what we felt we ought to be doing just because of the money.
Good. Was there a particular moment when you began to see yourself as a leader?
That's an interesting question. I I had an incredible gift not very far from here. When I was in college, I was given a scholarship to go to the Center for Creative Leadership in Greensboro, and went through their 1-week intensive, and it just threw a whole series of things at me that I had never occurred. And I had been team captains of things and naturally gravitated towards leadership roles. But I would say, I think sports probably is the place for me first that I started to think about it. And then in some ways, we were talking a little bit earlier, Nathan, I think one of the stretch things that happened to me when I was relatively young was in my late 20s. I was the senior warden, but basically the head of the board of my church. And it was I was not expecting to be asked, and upset a lot of people that they had picked me instead of a lot of longtime members of the church. And it forced me to lead in a very different way, and that caused me to think about how I led in the marketplace in a very different way as well. And so I think that was less thinking of myself as a leader. I would also share, answering too long, one of the most painful leadership lessons for me, but that made me think deeply and was a good, though painful experience, is when I was in college, I ran for student body president, and I was the heavy favorite, and then I lost. And it's long, I'm not going to tell the whole story. But, and I was not happy at the time, of course. And it was only, probably it took a couple years to look back. And actually my godmother, the mentor I talked about, and I were sort of debriefing it. And she asked the great question, which is, why did you run? And at the time, I would have said I'm running because there's all these things I want to accomplish. But if I'm really honest, I ran because it was a big thing to accomplish and so I could be student body president, not because I really had a deep heart to accomplish something. So it was really good that I lost, even though I like to think I would have done a good job if I had won. But it was a great lesson from her around power, because her view was, if you're really focused on getting something done, you'll get the influence and authority and power you need to get that done. If you're focused on getting the influence or the authority or the power, you'll get corrupted or turned away from your mission. And it took me a while to fully take that in, but I've certainly found that to be very true as I've watched leaders both succeed and fail.
Mm-hmm. In your book, Creating a Habitat for Humanity, you mentioned a scripture text that you learned from your grandmother that's been very important to you. Could you say something about that?
So Grandma, in addition to challenging us to be useful, would almost always quote her favorite verse from Scripture, from the prophet Micah in the Old Testament. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And I would say I heard it over and over again, but living into that was a much slower process for me. But in some ways, I think those are incredible marching orders for all of us in terms of that was certainly her definition of the good life.
Did you try to apply that both in for-profit and not-for-profit settings?
You know, I did. And I think when I was younger, I would say the big inflection point for me was probably not right away, but after 2 years on Wall Street, which were an amazing education, but I was not a great fit, and I was not living a life that sort of lined up with the kind of life I had pictured living. And so in applying for grants to go away, I really wanted to regain perspective, and living in Korea was a transformational year in so many ways for me, and it sort of took me out of every context that was familiar. But part of that year that was really special was the chance to get serious about my faith, and I think I came back from that experience owning my faith as an adult in a completely different way, and went to graduate school with the idea of learning the gifts to do some sort of missional work long term. And I would say in my early business jobs, my intent was to be salt and light in the business world, as fallibly as I did it. I think if one of those hard lessons early on is I was a great manager for people just like me at the beginning. I was not such a great manager for people who did not want to be led the way I wanted to be led. And I think I had to then learn a lot about leading serving people the way they were looking for help, as opposed to presuming that others would want the same, everything the way I would want it in terms of the managers I liked being or liked working for.
Great. You encourage leaders to develop a justice mindset. What do you mean by that?
I think it is such a big word, but to me it is so personal that I think all of us have to decide what are those short list of principles that I'm gonna really try to orient my life around, and that those are going to be unwavering, and to be much more flexible then about context and all the other pieces. And I think the big part for me was I was so consumed sometimes about thinking, what does God want me to do? And I think the lesson I first had to learn is God was much less concerned with what I was doing than who I was. And so I had a whole lot of work to do about character before I could focus on content. But then I think God cares deeply about the state of the world. And for me, we all have to look for the best definition of calling for me is from Frederick Buechner, who I think is a wonderful writer. And he said, your calling is where the deep gladness of your heart meets the world's great need. It's where the deep gladness of your heart meets the world's great need. And to me, justice is sometimes defined in the negative side, which is looking around and figuring out what's wrong and should be fixed. And so sometimes it's easier to see injustice than to see justice. But to me, it is really, the starting place ought to be, are the least advantaged in our society given truly a fair opportunity to lead the kind of life that God intended for them? And are there barriers that are getting in the way of any members of our society from having that fair opportunity? And I think it is, I knew it from a story perspective from the civil rights movement, but honestly I was so small in that time that it wasn't real for me. And I think where it became real for me was visiting rural India quite a number of years later. So this was 2001 or 2 when I was making the decision to leave the private sector, and I went to serve in rural India, and it was, I think, one of those very clear moments of truly of seeing injustice in a way that was palpable for me. And Pastor named Bill Hybels has a phrase, a holy discontent, and it's one of those things that are upsetting enough that it actually makes you decide you're going to do something about something you see in society. And I think we all have tons of things we complain about, we whine about, we think somebody ought to do something about. And then the question is, what's a big enough issue, and when does God grab you by the neck strongly enough that you decide that you're going to do that? And I think for me, I had always cared about justice issues, but seeing a group of people in India, even though the law said this was illegal, these were a group of outcasts called the Bungi, who were literally only allowed to hand clean latrines and clean up dead animals. Were not allowed to live in community with the rest of the community. They had to live outside the village walls. And about half of these kids at that time in life were dying by the age of 13 because of the conditions they were living in. And it just, I think, sort of resurrected in me deep, visceral sense of injustice in a way that made me want to come back and decide, okay, as best I can tell, now's the time, and I'm going to be out of the business world and spend the rest of my life doing something around global poverty and justice issues, and had no idea how that would work, but had a deep sense of conviction about it.
Over the last decade, Habitat for Humanity has grown substantially. I think you may be serving 10 times as many people as you were a decade ago. Can you explain some of that, why that's happened, how that's happened?
I think first, and I'll say early, what I'm sharing is in the context of my faith, and there may be a whole array of faith perspectives in the room. I think one of the commonalities across all faiths is a strong belief that we should care for people in need in our communities and in the world. And I think for me, I would say first it was a God thing. I would say second, I just took, one of the things that was really helpful is I took a lot of time when I first joined, and just did a whole lot of listening before trying to decide anything. And not surprisingly, in any large dispersed organizations, most of the great ideas are coming up from the field. And so as I went around the U.S. and then went around the world, just trying to understand what was working and what was not working, somebody had given me great advice, and I asked 5 questions. I asked, what are 3 things that should never change about Habitat? What are 3 things that desperately need to change at Habitat? What are you afraid I might do? What are you afraid I might not do? And what advice would you give me? And I talked to hundreds and hundreds of people and all the different sort of stakeholders of Habitat, so donors and partners and families and all of our affiliate and country staff members and partners of Habitat in the different sectors, and got a lot of consistent answers. And it was really interesting. There was a great passion not to lose the center of what had made Habitat so powerful, and there was a great energy to unleash some creativity and innovation and not be as locked in to a more rigid model of how Habitat practiced. And so we basically went through a period of just giving huge amount of permission for people to explore. We had a couple of tragic events that I would never want to have happen again, but we learned so much out of them. So the year I joined, the Indian Ocean tsunami hit, which was probably the worst global housing disaster in recent times. And then Hurricane Katrina hit in the U.S. right as I joined, which was the worst U.S. housing disaster that had happened in decades. And it was both horrific in both cases, but we were able to innovate around how to scale up quickly because of the desperate need and do a lot of things differently that would have been sort of sacred cows or taboo if it weren't such a crisis. And I think in some ways it allowed Habitat to move forward because we had to respond to these 2 gigantic disasters. In Asia, we built 25,000 houses in about 5 years, which was by far the biggest construction project we had ever taken on. And learning to do that built the scale in a ways that led to explosive growth. And Asia is now our biggest region by far. And some of the learning capacity...
Bigger than the U.S.?
By far. So the big surprise, now the dollars are driven in the U.S., but 95% of our families served are outside the U.S., and more than half of our worldwide families are in Asia in a given year. And so we took the sort of don't waste a crisis view and learned a lot about scaling in that short piece. The other thing was more philosophical. We looked at how do we serve families that were too poor for a Habitat house, and how could we have meaningful service in a way the traditional Habitat model that has been so powerful and effective the limitation on it was to partner with Habitat around the world. You needed to have land and you needed enough income to pay back the loan for a mortgage. And that really cut out a huge chunk of the world. And we wanted to have ways to have housing solutions for the families that were too poor to afford even a $2,000 mortgage for a home. And so we moved to helping those families build in stages. And we would still not view a family as fully housed until they met all the conditions of decent housing, but doing it on terms they could afford. So we unleashed a huge amount of incremental building, which is really how very low-income families have built all the way along. And we've seen, and then moved with that much more heavily into the advocacy side, which had always been a principle, but we didn't really have a program of advocacy trying to impact the policy environment. And then the final piece of growth has been really outside of our direct construction and the numbers we just talked about, but trying to impact the market and the way the market provides housing. And so that has led us more outside the U.S. into the whole world of housing microfinance. And we've had, in addition to the hundreds of thousands of families we're working with directly, we have been able to create financial access to loans for now a couple of million additional families, which we're really, and we think that could scale at a really quite extraordinary level in addition to our core development work.
Do you consider Habitat an organization or a movement?
That's a great question. I think it was founded to be a movement more than an organization, and we never want to lose that movement aspect of it. And I've got to see lots of Habitat family in the room, but it's we needed, what we heard back is we needed some elements of organization. Mm-hmm. So we needed some professionalization in the system and some higher accountability and structure. But we also, I think passionately, Habitat has worked because it's locally owned in so many places. And I think the movement aspect we don't want to lose is the power. And one of my favorite examples that right now is tragically getting messed up by the government and the earthquake is in Habitat Nepal. And it was a lovely example of almost going back to our roots, where we had a very good but small habitat program helping a few hundred families in our traditional model. And then they realized that if they trained these existing community groups and gave them all the sort of habitat software and gave them financing and equipped them, they could build a lot more houses. So they went from a few hundred to a few thousand. And then they realized, you know what, if we really want to impact the housing deficit in Nepal, we're never going to get there building 3,000, 4,000 houses, even though that's a really good thing. So the question they asked, which is fantastic, is what would it take to reduce the housing deficit by a meaningful amount in our country? And this is a very poor country. And so we had 800,000 young people come out and advocate in Nepal last year to get a law changed. And they got a law changed 2 years ago. And they got the law changed so a government CSR law would now allocate 1% of the government CSR fund to a housing finance fund. And then we trained all of our community partners all over the country on how to access that government financing fund. So now we're providing consulting support. So we wouldn't count them as habitat houses, but they say they're implementing the habitat model. And before the earthquake, they were on track to build 40,000 houses last year with a strategic plan to build 500,000 houses by 2025. Now, I have no idea if we'll get there, but that's the movement part we don't want to lose, which is really changing hearts and minds.
Are you able to capture the hearts and minds of young people in the U.S. for your mission?
You know, I think, I hope so is the answer, but I'm very encouraged by all the young people I meet traveling around. And I think this generation is the most idealistic and certainly the most connected to the world of any generation we've had. And I think then the question for us is, how do we get people to care more about housing? And I'll ask a dangerous question in the room. Did anyone in the room grow up in really horrific poverty housing? And I see one hand went up, and it's, and I don't want to put on the spot, but I think that's why housing never gets on the agenda, because all the decision makers grew up in good housing. And so, so one of our challenges, honestly, is to get housing on the agenda, because it keeps getting left off of the service agenda. But I am actually wildly encouraged. We hire hundreds of AmeriCorps and Vista workers in the National Service Program every year, and they are spectacular young people. And we have now 500 plus campus chapters, high school and college chapters, including our great Wake Forest campus chapter. And we've seen great energy and some pretty more remarkable things happen from these student leaders. So I'm an optimist on this, but we have a lot of work to do.
How do you attract and nurture talent within your organization?
You know, it's something we never can do enough of, and we feel like we never have enough resources. But what I've learned is that sometimes the research is pretty interesting, that when high capacity leaders get interviewed on what was most formative for their leadership development, generally it was not getting sent off to a 1-week seminar or to additional classroom training once they're out in the marketplace. The most important was they got cross-functional or stretch leadership opportunities to go take on a sort of extracurricular task force or team project or something else. And so one of the things we try to do very intentionally is create opportunities for experience in a couple ways. One is to keep them close to the mission. So we don't have stock options, we don't have bonuses, we don't have a lot of the other things, but we have people who are unbelievably mission driven. And something I learned at Disney is the most important thing first is who do you hire? And we try to select for a deep sense of mission commitment and organize our hiring process so people would self-select out if they're not mission driven. And then the second step is then can we give them work experience? And I think the bad news for those of you who are young in your careers or thinking about them is often some of the best experience is what you do in addition to your core job, which can make you tired. But often, sometimes the best opportunities are where you're doing a great job at your core responsibilities, and then you still put your hand up to take on some kind of extra assignment or stretch assignment that allows you to work across functions or across boundaries. And one of the things we've seen that's incredibly powerful is if we have a big need in one area, if we can figure out how to make it work, we'll send a team leader from Atlanta to go serve in Manila for 2 months, build that capacity, teach people there, and come back. But that's an amazing learning opportunity for them, and vice versa. So we try to move people around. And then we have something called mission leave, where after you've worked for a year with us, you can have paid time off to go volunteer with Habitat somewhere in the world, because we want people to stay connected to the mission. And it's really important, if you're in the finance department, that you understand how what you're doing in the finance department is translating into somebody getting a house in Kenya or Cambodia or Guatemala. And so so we want people to stay anchored in why we do what we do, because that ends up being a huge piece. But the competency I see the desperate need for are really boundary-spanning leaders that can lead across functions, across cultures, across geographies, and make things work. Virtually everything we do ends up crossing a bunch of boundaries. And so in a way, to be effective at Habitat long-term, that building that capacity is crucial for us.
You've said something about students who might be interested in not-for-profit leadership, but would you have other advice? If someone thinks that's their passion, not to first go into the for-profit sector and then back, but they would like to be a leader in the not-for-profit sector, what kind of advice would you have for them?
You know, I think the good news is now there are careers in the nonprofit sector, and doubly good news is sometimes you can actually get more responsibility at a young age in a not-for-profit than you can in the private sector. And so it is, so I think they're great opportunities, but I would say first get your toes in the water. So the wonderful thing is volunteer and go out, because often in the process of volunteering, you can get to know an organization, you can build relationships, that may actually lead to job opportunities. But the other side is you can also get a sense of where the nonprofit area is so vast. So, because I think there are two questions. One is it a mission I believe in? And then two, is there a role in that mission that's a good fit for my gifts and skills? And I've seen people absolutely attaching to the right mission, but then they're in a role that they're actually not gifted for, and that's not very edifying ultimately or successful. And so I think you've got to have the self-awareness and do the homework to figure out how you can add value, and then figure out how you add value in a context or a mission or that you have a real heart for. And you may not get all of that day one, but I think it is, again, if you can think about those first roles as part of your continuing education. But I've seen, we've seen wonderful young people who've come in, worked often, may have started as an AmeriCorps or a Vista worker with one of our local affiliates. They then get hired, and they're leading, they're managing volunteers, which is incredible management experience. They're running construction sites. They're managing complicated projects, and they may not long-term stay there, but it's a fabulous experience. So I think there's much more opportunity now for meaningful careers all the way along in the nonprofit sector than there probably were when I was in school.
Let me ask you about what you hope your legacy would be. If you had to look back, what your legacy at Habitat?
It's hard. I hope, I think those words, the words you're looking for would be the well done, good and faithful servant. It's, and I would hope, that and I hope I get to do this for a long time, but for the season I've had the privilege of being a part of Habitat's mission, my hope is it would be, I think the biggest piece would be that we dramatically increase the number of families who know what it is to wake up and go to bed every night with a safe, decent, affordable place to sleep and raise their families.
Yeah, great. We want to broaden the questions and the discussion now. So as Millicent mentioned earlier, the hashtag is at WFU Leads, and also we'll have questions from the audience. So Millicent.
We're actually going to take our first question from the audience, so if anyone wants to come down to the mic and ask the first question.
It's very brave to be the first one. Thank you.
It's exciting to be the first one. Well, this is an It's a political season, and sorry about that. But so you wanted to go into politics originally. So both parties seem to be struggling to find a good leader at the moment. If you were the next president, all right, how would you change public housing? And also, have you seen great models of how churches can be the most effective in assisting to make public housing more effective?
Wow, that's great. Nice, easy one to start with.
Yeah.
If God help the country, if I were president, I would actually be really excited to attack housing, because I think it is underfunded, and the way I think we have to think about it is the entire continuum of housing, and I think we need more all the way along the continuum, basically supportive housing, subsidized rental housing, and then I actually do believe, passionately obviously with Habitat, that affordable home ownership is a piece of the mix, because the data is pretty powerful. And if you look at housing today, there are a couple things I would certainly change. One is we have a strange thing today. If you're very low income in America, you get a housing subsidy, but we actually don't have enough for everybody. So I believe we need to have more funding for the core rental support for our lowest income families. Now, the great irony is, who gets the most housing subsidy in America? Rich people. It's a very strange thing. 2/3 of all the housing subsidy goes to people that are wealthy enough to itemize their taxes and buy a home and get a mortgage interest deduction. So, and I'm not opposed to that. I think that's fantastic. There are a lot of benefits to the community. But it's very odd that the public would subsidize your second home or your boat, but we would not subsidize a family that makes just enough that they can't get rental assistance. And we give no housing subsidy to the group that's between 20 and 50% of median income, or 25 and 50% of median income. So I would fix that. So the first thing I would do is I would create a housing credit that if you buy a house and don't itemize your taxes, you could still get the mortgage interest deduction in the form of a tax credit. And I would limit the deductibility at a much lower number. I wouldn't get rid of the mortgage interest deduction, but I'd cap it at a far smaller number and get rid of the deduction for second homes and for boats and other vehicles in a heartbeat. I would increase the total, and I actually would support I'm a fan, there's controversy, but what's been known as the Atlanta model. I think the Hope 6, I would actually resurrect and support, whether you call it currently in Obama administration the Promise Communities or the Hope 6 model, but a rewarding mixed income, mixed use development. Because what we're learning about inequity is that segregating people by income is bad for everybody, and it is a failed model. And the best thing we can do is create communities where people can live across income levels and be in community together. And so, ideally near where they work. And if we can fit those pieces together, so I'll vote for somebody who has that platform as long as they have some second ones. It is. The second is, how can the faith community get involved, which is a fantastic question. And I think, Habitat was built by the faith community, truly. So many of our Habitat affiliates started in church basements and church offices, and were launched by people of faith, and not only Christians. We've had incredible champions around the world of multiple faiths that have helped support Habitat's growth. And I think, I believe actually faith institutions need to demonstrate in our unchurched world. So I think the church needs to show today how they are relevant in the community, which really goes back almost to that Acts 2 vision of what a church is. And I think churches need to be inside out. And I think the first invitation for people in today's society isn't come to church with me. It should be come serve with me in the community. And I think the churches have got to be out in the community, building relationship, but being practical demonstrations of God's love in a way that is changing hearts and minds. And in doing that, my hope is together we can sort of change society's views of the kind of community we all want to be a part of. And I don't think that's a Democrat or Republican issue. I think that is it's really a bigger vision of what good community can look like.
Wonderful. From the Twitter feed, you mentioned your work in Nepal and how creativity influenced finding a solution to housing issues. How does creativity function in your own leadership style?
Oh, think about that. I think where creativity is so important is it makes life fun and interesting. And one of the axioms that I've used over and over again is we want to be religious about our principles, but not our tactics. And sometimes we can get caught saying that the specific way we are doing our work is a principle, when it's not really a principle, it's a tactic. And that may be how we subsidize our houses, how we construct our houses. And because people are so attached to habitat, they can get locked into one specific way to do habitat. We're trying to say there's a short list of principles that we want to hold on to. And in a way, the link to creativity is if we don't get too boxed in, that leaves much more room for things different. One of the ways, I think, for me personally to stay tied to creativity is to keep looking outside of habitat. So not to sort of only stay in the habitat bubble. And one of the reasons I do outside board work is it brings me into different ways of thinking and different pieces. So, it's fast. I mean, I don't know why they chose me, but I love being on the Federal Reserve Board because it's a totally different group of people and mindset than affordable housing. But it's a fascinating, and I can be an advocate there for policy that I think will be better. But it's I love touching and being connected to people that think differently and who may have different perspectives to bring. And so we try to keep an environment in habitat that is always questioning and leaving room for questioning. And I think you can have creativity and accountability, that those are not at odds with one another, but that we can have creativity and then rigor behind the creativity. And I think for some people, the definition of creativity is no boundaries. And I actually think in the academic setting, what we've actually seen is most of the great creative breakthroughs have come within boundaries. And so I love giving architects the challenge of design me something that is beautiful and costs very little and uses only renewable materials and will last for a very long time. And they say, well, that's really hard. Yes, that's really hard. Be creative. Don't think differently about it. And I think we can be bound by our core principles in a serious way and have room for enormous creativity within those boundaries.
Yes. Do you have any words of wisdom to households that may have been caught up in the robotic foreclosure scandal that's been going on for the last 5 years? Some families are still dealing with loss mitigation departments that keep denying them some sort of restructuring. I mean, it seems to be pretty silly. And how do they get out of that without keeping damaged credit and staying in their houses?
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, I wish I had an easy. I don't think there is an easy answer to that. It is the really hard thing structurally is you've got everybody in the middle, and there are people who took advantage of the system, and we don't want to reward the people who took advantage of the system, and then there are people who just got caught and crunched in the system. And I think it's easier to talk about how to make it better now than it is to actually fix the prior mess. And so I wish I had a better answer. We are working very closely with the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. We've been part of looking at the new mortgage regulations from a sort of pro-low-income family perspective and trying to make sure that the things that led to the crisis don't happen again. But that's very different than getting out of it. And other than, advocacy and, individual by individual helping families get the resources, because often they don't know how to work the system. And so I think the best answer I give is just coming alongside those families and helping them navigate the system, because it can be overwhelming for a well-educated person, and if for someone who doesn't have deep financial literacy and legal skills, it is highly complex and complicated. And so for those of us who know how to do that, to come along and support it. But I think it's interesting. One of the things I'm proud of on Habitat's behalf is when you looked at the foreclosure crisis, in communities where the foreclosure crisis went up as high as 20 or 25%, Habitat foreclosures went up to between 1.5% and 2%. And if you think about it, Habitat only lends to subprime borrowers who couldn't qualify for a loan even in the freest funds. So it's not that low-income families can't own homes, which is what I hated to hear out of the whole foreclosure crisis, because really we actually saw empirically higher income families defaulted at a higher level ratio than low-income families. But what is clearly true is lending people more money than they can afford to borrow under terms they don't understand, that are going to have surprises and balloon payments and other things, it was a terrible failure. And there was a whole corruption of the whole housing value chain. So that piece, I think, needs to be fixed. But I still think homeownership long-term has been the best way for low-income families, particularly minority low-income families, to build assets over time and build generational wealth for their families. And so I think the overreaction to homeownership was a bad idea. I think it would be a terrible thing for our society, both for the communities and for the families themselves.
How did you handle the pressures of being a young leader? And was there ever a moment that you lost motivation to lead?
Ooh. I think I had a couple of big setbacks. That's the problem with the lovely introductions you get, is they make it all look nice and clean. And I went to Marriott, and life was good, and then the recession hit in 1991, and I lost my job, which and that, it was actually great to lose your job early enough to realize that it's okay to lose your job, and more jobs are out there. And in fact, it led to a fantastic job with Disney that I probably wouldn't have pursued if it hadn't happened. And so I think there was a lesson there. I don't know that I've ever had a time where I lost my desire to lead. I think I've had times where I think the saddest leadership lesson to me was probably when I was president of a retail chain and we got bought by another company. And the saddest part was the acquisition was good for our shareholders, and we couldn't not do it. We would have been sued every which way. But it turned out to be a really bad acquisition, and ultimately turned out to be a bad thing for the acquiring company and a devastating thing for the employees of the company that I was part of. And I think it was, I just took very personally that even though I ultimately left the organization, from a long-term perspective, it didn't work, and a lot of people ended up losing jobs. It was an industry that was going away, so it was a tough challenge. We were music stores back when young people actually bought music. What a concept, on these plastic discs. Some of you may have heard such a thing exists, but it is. But I think those would have been a couple of the toughest times for me as a leader.
You used to work for organizations like Goldman Sachs, Marriott, Best Buy, et cetera, that are often criticized for their culture of consumption that they perpetuate. How did you walk away from that? Like, what kept you grounded? Would you say it was your faith? Would you say you woke up one morning and there was just a revelation that essentially led you to work towards the exact opposite, an organization whose culture is focused completely on giving?
Yeah, I would say I would take slight exception in parts. I wouldn't lump all those companies together, because I'm actually I think we have to be careful not to demonize business. I'm actually a giant fan of business. The question is, business to what end, and how are they operated? And I actually think Marriott is a fantastic company that creates a great product and treats their people well, and and delivers consistent, quality hospitality to a huge number of people every day around the world. I think Disney was a split culture, honestly. When I was there, I worked on the theme park side, designing new theme parks and resorts. That was just cool as can be. And Disney brings really joy to people in wonderful ways. Now, they're not perfect, and there were some tougher aspects as well. But I think that business can be a noble calling, and actually there's nothing more empowering to someone than giving them a decent paying job that allows them to take care of their family. And so I think we desperately need more community-focused and community-minded business leaders to create great companies that create great jobs. I think the tension in there sometimes is where companies are not, either are not treating their people well, and there certainly are examples of that, and or are not really creating value for society. And I think goes back again to a structural question of our tax code, but it seems to me we should reward companies that create jobs and create value more than we reward companies that just shuffle things around or are not creating value. and it is. But I think it's a very personal choice. So for me personally, the trigger, I think, was it had always been part of the plan. It was a little bit opportunistic when my company got taken over, and I thought maybe that's the kick in the seat of the pants that I need to get out to make the jump I'd been thinking about for a long time. I had, maybe that learning curve had come to the point where it was time for me to move I think for anybody, that's a very personal decision. But I would frame it more in, am I using my gifts in a way that's adding value to the world? And I think that there's a million ways to do that, and nonprofit is just one segment or one of those opportunities. And I think we have to be careful, for those of us in the nonprofit community, of being holier than thou, because I think nonprofits should actually be held to a higher standard. I think sometimes they get a free pass on efficiency and effectiveness and being rigorous about community impact. And I think we should be hard on ourselves in the same way. But I think if I were to turn your question, I think the biggest piece to me would be, the saddest is when I talk to somebody who's working at something they really don't like, and they've always wanted to do something else, but they've created a set of things that essentially makes them feel trapped. And I have a friend who said, for his whole, as long as I've known him, what I really want to do is go teach and really impact middle school boys in the inner city, because that's my heart is there. And he's done something on the side. He's going to do that as soon as he has enough money. Well, here's the trap. He has a lot of money. And how much enough money is turns out to be an elastic amount for many people, and you can get sort of caught in that. And I think it all boils back then to you have to start back to the principle, what's your definition of success? And as soon as your definition of success becomes having the most toys or making the most money, and we are bombarded with that. And one of the things that scared me, and I think there's a desperate need for our financial sector, so again, I want to be cautious not to indict the financial sector, but for me personally, when I was working at Goldman Sachs, I thought that in order for me to compete successfully and win at Goldman, I couldn't do that on my terms, and therefore I better get out, because being a competitive person, I would then compete on somebody else's terms, and that was going to be really hard to live the life I wanted to lead and be successful. And if you look at the Gallup polling, it's pretty depressing. It would say the U.S. is better than most of the world, but only about 20 to 30% of people are really engaged and like what they do on a daily basis. And that's terrible. So I think while you have this amazing set of resources for those of you who are students here at Wake, really try, you won't get all the answers, but take some time to think about and test out what are the aspects of life that really start my batteries up. And I'm impacted. I had a headhunter that really reshaped me a little bit, but the founder of this small faith-based headhunting firm, his name was Arthur Miller Jr., not the playwright, a different Arthur Miller, and he wrote a great book, though they messed up the title. The original title was You Can't Be Anything You Want to Be, and I thought that was a great title, because essentially the argument was we are all gifted, but we're all gifted in different ways, and if you don't know, essentially it's common sense. Where do my gifts meet, my passions? Because if you just follow the passion with no giftedness, you're not actually going to make much of an impact. And if you just follow your gifts, but your heart's not connected to some kind of purpose, that's not going to have much impact. So you're really looking for that intersection of giftedness and purpose. And if you can find those, and his argument is, you don't find it through a test. The way to find it, and I thought this was really interesting, is think back to your very earliest memories. And if you think back not to what the world said you were good at, but what gave you a deep sense of satisfaction, that pattern is remarkably consistent all the way through your life. So if you can filter out the attaboys and attagirls that the world gives you and really drill in on what gave you a sense of joy and real satisfaction, that's a great indicator at where that personal intersection might be for you. That was way more than you asked for.
Wonderful. That was our last question. Thank you.
Great. Jonathan, we deeply appreciate your being here, and I think it is clear that you have fulfilled what your grandmother hoped, to live a useful life, and thank you for sharing it with us tonight. Please join me in thanking Johnny.
I can steal the last word, Nathan, thank you for your leadership here. I get teased because I turn down a huge number, most of my speaking engagements, and I disproportionately seem to coming to North Carolina, which is a personal bias, and my great friend Sylvia in the front row here. But I love Wake's ethos, and I think not just that they have an incredible motto of pro humanitate, but that you're living it here, and that made me very excited to come and be part of the community. So thank you. It's great to be with you all.
Thank you, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.